Hi. I wanted to share a few thoughts about racism. Just having said that, I think one or two might click off, and that's okay. I know more than a few who want nothing to do with a discussion of racism, let alone people of color. And I think it's most sad when that takes place from people who consider themselves to be good and moral and upstanding and perhaps even Christian. Uh, they have only associated with white people all of their lives. By associate, I mean they've had acquaintances, they've had encounters, they've had occasion to interact with others unlike themselves. But when given the choice, based upon their upbringing and their background, they remained in their white neighborhoods, their white families, and among their white friends. They went to white schools and they watched white television programs because they felt vaguely uncomfortable seeing those people in positions of prosperity, or they might have laughed at George Jefferson and probably favored Archie Bunker. Those are dating me references to my television years long ago. I don't recall being overtly racist in the sense of using racial slurs, for example. I don't remember using any. I may have, but even in my addiction and drunkenness, I don't recall it, and I'd actually recall it being offensive to me. When I was a little boy, I could swear like a sailor, and often did. I took great pride in a vulgar vocabulary, at least among my little friends. But it wasn't long as I got older that the F word, really rung hollow to me, along with some other swearing, particularly taking God's name in vain. Again, even as a teenage addict, sofa surfing, getting high every day, pills, marijuana, LSD. I did not enjoy even in expressions of racial jokes or those things. I can't say that it's to my favor. Um, I was raised by some very good people, moral people, but there were family members that I had that were racist. They didn't belong to the Klan, but there were some jokes, there were remarks, and more than that, there was this, again, us and them feeling. A good bit of that is rooted in ignorance of history, black history. But then that's in part because that's what we were educated in the schools. We were educated to believe that the cowboys were good and the Indians were wrong. And yes, it was terrible what we did, but, we're sure glad to have the land and the power and the money. We're not giving it up, let alone share very much of it. There are expressions, though, of racism in my life certainly of neglect. Despite having close relations, even mentorships, with African Americans and people of all races, I suppose, ethnicities, over the years, at least since I was 20 years old, even attempting to attend a predominantly black college, which family was not in favor of. I couldn't come up with the money. And that was through the advice and urging of a mentor, an African American mentor. He was trying to keep me in college as well as widen my perspectives. I think he did widen my perspectives, but he failed to keep me in school. I did not get my degree in theology until midlife. And I've pastored multicultural churches. All of my churches have been multicultural, multiracial. God's led me, and I've had some very good friendships. People have been very kind to me. And yet, it's only recently, the last few years, that I've been able to understand or to see not just the systemic nature of racism, but the systemic nature of all problems. The interrelatedness, the interconnectedness of this broad swath of humanity in our cultures, in our economies, in our politics, and certainly in our religion, our faith or our lack of it, our worship or our denial of it. The world is traumatized with violence, racial violence, domestic violence, regardless of class or color. It's easy to blame others for that violence. But I see it in a systemic way. That is, as a system, an organic, living thing. This thing is human interaction. The community of nations, of neighborhoods, of towns and cities and farms, cross-cultural. Sometimes barriers are erected, sometimes they're broken down, sometimes they're leapt over, sometimes they're hidden behind. But barriers there are, large walls there are that separate us from knowing and loving one another. I believe that much of racism, and this is where it comes home to me, is in self-protection. What Larry Crabb called the sin of self-protection. And I agree that the reason sin is so hard to overcome because it's rooted in self-preservation. Jesus said that we can only have life if we lose our life. That it's through losing this life that we gain a new life. That we must die to be born again. That the first must be last and the last must be first. And that God looks upon the least of these, my brethren, as very special in his eyes. God is a God of justice and a God of righteousness. And he has a very special regard for the widow, for the orphan, for the stranger, for the foreigner, and for those who we think, wrongly so often, are our enemies. It is in the sins of omission, my ignorance of the systemic nature of sin broadly, but racism in particular. I have a growing awareness of the inequalities that persist. We may have civil rights laws. There may not be any direct, open Jim Crow segregation allowed in our communities, in our states, on the federal level. But that spirit is still there. I believe there are many, many white folk who would rather see people drink from separate fountains and go to separate schools and go to separate churches and live in separate neighborhoods and occupy separate spaces, who would build barriers, because deep down they may not believe that they're genetically superior. Some still do, many perhaps, but they believe in their rights as a class, but also their rights as a race. White supremacy has been growing for at least 400 years. There could not have been any colonization in the world by Western Europe without slavery. There would be no United States as we know it today. There might be a United States, but slaves were the primary, we would say, resource, or what was the primary means. They were considered property and wealth. To have many slaves was to be wealthy. Not simply because the slaves themselves were valuable, but because of what they could achieve and do for you. They could pick your cotton and take care of your children and cook your meals and sew your clothes and even bear your children, as Thomas Jefferson showed, among others. My understanding and my growth in understanding and knowledge of what constitutes trauma and the growing field of complex trauma has led me to believe ever more strongly in the ongoing post-traumatic stress of slavery spanning generations. Add to that the daily trauma of being treated as less than when you are served in a grocery store or a restaurant, or refused service, or made to wait much longer than your white customers. When with every look, often with a touch, with expressions, idioms, manners of speech that I am not sensitive to. But my African American friend, my friends are. How cruel. I don't know what it's like to live with that pressure. It's not that, oh, I have to be accepted by my white friends around me. I don't want to indulge in some kind of patronization. I don't need the approval of my white friends. I don't need the approval of my black friends. I don't need the approval of my Latino friends or Asian friends to be a man, to be a person. But I am not classified as someone different and less than simply because of the color of my skin. I have white privilege. I have many white privileges. Economically, socially, romantically. Certainly throughout my life. I'm thankful that I'm not judged on the basis of the color of my skin, I guess. Maybe is that something to be thankful for? I don't know about that. To be thankful that I'm white? I'm thankful that I don't have to suffer some of the things that other people have suffered. But then I think, why can't I identify? Why can't I be empathetic? Why can't I say, that's my brother, that's my sister? Galatians says that the law of Christ is to bear one another's burdens. Galatians 6:3, is it? Bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. How can I call myself a Christian if I'm not willing to shoulder the burden of racism? I'm talking about racism here. It's not all there is in the world. I understand that. I've spent quite a bit of time studying on child abuse, childhood trauma and violence. I have not explored the trauma of war, of genocide, like I could. I'm aware of it. The trauma of death, the trauma of poverty. The trauma, by the way, is that which threatens our person, which threatens us with loss, but particularly the loss of life. The root feeling in trauma is fear. Push it a little farther and it's terror. And a person can lose their mind. And even when they don't lose their mind, it eats away at the soul and the spirit. It creates a numbness, a sense of meaninglessness, a sense of shame, of worthlessness. It's all rooted in this fear. And many people I know have lived their whole lives hiding out of shame for what was done to them, and perhaps later what they did to others as a result of the abuse heaped upon them. You add to that the trauma of racism, on top of poverty, upon top of a family that's a mother that's a single parent, or you add that to a child whose father is an alcoholic and the mother drinks, and the only food they get is that at school. Yes, that happens to white children too. But there are systemic problems within our inner cities. The reasons for poverty in Chicago, as one has said, are not the same reasons for poverty in Appalachia. We shouldn't conflate racism with classism. There are similarities, but there are differences. They're not the same. In Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, one of the things that I learned very quickly and agreed with very quickly was that white people are fragile when it comes to talking about race. We resist even understanding or knowing our own racial identity. People think they're not racist because they say, oh, I don't see color. I don't see color. Everybody's the same to me. Well, no, it's not true. Everybody's not the same. Everybody does, because we think everybody's the same, that doesn't absolve us from racism. In fact, it's a very racist statement in many people's eyes, in my eyes, to say, oh, everybody's the same. There are very, very distinct differences. It's not the denial of the differences that constitutes, well, it is the denial of difference, and it's the denial and appreciation of difference. It's the lack of acceptance of difference. It's the implication that being different means we are not equal that is racist. I think it's racist to say that all lives matter in today's context. If you take that statement out of the context of race relations, this might be a different story. All lives do matter, but they don't matter to people. All lives do not matter to all people. All lives matter to God. God is not racist. But when a white person says, hey, all lives matter, what they're actually saying is, I don't want to acknowledge that there are people in this world who have unique trauma and difficulties heaped upon them by the white race, and that's our distinction today. The white race is an artificial construct, just as the black race is an artificial construct. At some point, it became necessary in our minds, in our thought, to divide ourselves by color, to distinguish ourselves by color. And I believe that the distinctions came from white people. When whites believed that they had greater civilization, that they had greater intelligence, that they had greater capabilities, that they were inherently better than others, that they were born to rule. Can you imagine what it took, what it takes for a civilization to enslave 10 million people? At the time of the Civil War, I've heard estimates from 4 to 6 million slaves, south and the north. Apart from any sociological reasons, apart from economic pressures and how capitalism supported slaves as property, slaves as wealth, there is the moral problem, the sin problem. It is immoral not only to own people, but to think you have the right to own people. The very idea that one person should own another, that a person can own another, how is that? How does that come about? But we have an America today where those same feelings, those same values, those same sentiments permeate America. I think it's a common immorality among nationalists. The very idea of nationalism, whether it's American nationalism, Polish nationalism, British nationalism, or even African nationalism, the idea of nationalism, again, creates alienation by its very nature. It's self-protective. It's saying that me and my needs, our culture, our family are more important than yours. It's the will to power. When Adam and Eve were cast out of the garden, their first feeling was fear. Well, before they were cast out of the garden, when they were hiding in the garden, They heard the voice of God and they were afraid. They said God was looking for them. God wanted to see them, and they didn't want to be seen because they were ashamed of their nakedness. Their eyes had been opened and they understood good and evil. They lost their robe of innocence. They were ashamed, and their first reaction was to blame God and to blame each other. Their sin created shame and guilt, and that created the need to protect themselves, even from God, and to protect themselves from blame from one another. The trauma had set in, the corruption had set in, and we've all inherited that. It's bad enough when one person is racist, but you take a collective, you take the board of an organization, you take a group of managers in an organization, you take a group of pastors or church leaders. If you have learned or studied anything about group dynamics, you know how people will go along with something that is wrong, perhaps even evil, because they're afraid to speak up, they're afraid to resist, they're afraid to go against the majority. Again, they protect themselves and their self-interest. They don't want to lose their job. I have to support my family, they say. Prison guards bring drugs into the prison because they fear for their lives and they fear for their family. Before he killed himself, before he killed himself, my brother-in-law had been a prison guard. And he didn't last very long because he was being coerced into bringing contraband into the prison. This is in Alabama. His reason for suicide was something else, I suppose. It's complex, as I said. I'm fighting against any racism within myself that I find or see. I don't like it if I go into town and there's a group of young black men gathered together, and my first response is self-protection. I don't like that about myself. Of course, young white kids together do the same thing to me. Perhaps it's my age, but I don't like it. I didn't like it when I and a friend of mine were in Manhattan and we took the subway and we got off by mistake in Harlem, and we quickly retraced our steps because we were afraid. I don't like being afraid of unknown things. I don't like thinking that because I don't know something, I am vulnerable. I don't like mistrusting someone because they're different than myself. I remember being in jail when I was 18 and around Dade County, and we were all in a jail together, and there was a very large black man in a single cell across from us. And his behavior frightened me. He wasn't loud or boisterous. He seemed a looming threat. I found out the next day he was a really nice guy. As we all filed out of our cells to go to breakfast. Oh, man. I am not going to remain silent. I hope you understand that. This is not the time for silence. It's not a time. I'm not going down to protest. I'm not going to burn anything. I'm not going to grab a megaphone. Not because I don't feel that it's right. I don't know exactly how I feel about it, but I do know that for me is not what brings about change. Not real change. But I've got to say, the protests have raised my awareness. I need to read more of the what are to some sacred text, historical text, Richard Wright and W.E.B. Du Bois, and I read Malcolm X years ago. Good book. Get it, read it. Malcolm X. Autobiography of Malcolm X. Maybe I'm boasting, I don't know. I enjoyed it. I learned something. A few things. I'm not familiar with black literature that speaks directly to white privilege and racism. I need to be more widely read. And that principle is very basic. It's very basic teaching to conflict resolution. If you perceive that there's a conflict, and racism is certainly a conflict, if you perceive that there is a conflict, a potential conflict or a real conflict between yourself and others, that conflict is not going to be resolved in a favorable way unless you can both begin to see through the other's eyes. Make the effort at least to learn, to empathize, to say, tell me, how is it with you? What do you need from me? Why do you need it? How can I be of help? How can I stop being a hindrance? What part can I play in healing the rift between us? That's hard for me to do. I so easily, as an introvert, retreat into protecting myself. I have been prone over my life to sudden outbursts of anger, violent temper. Burying it, repressing it until suddenly it burst out. There have been a few dangerous moments. I need this grace of God so much. I'm disappointed, very disappointed in those who say they are Christians and who perceive themselves as battling against sin. Perhaps they're eating too many donuts. Maybe they break the speed limit too often. Maybe they're impatient with their children, wives with husbands, and husbands with wives. Maybe they're battling against adultery and lying and stealing. At least the desires in their heart. I'm speaking of those who perceive themselves to be good Christians. I just find it incredible that there's so little open confession and repentance for racism. This silence, this deafening silence that implies that I've not been racist, I've never done anything. There are some really good people. There are some precious good people in this world. But many, so many of us have indulged these secret sins, and some of us have been quite overt. Do you snicker and laugh at the racist joke? Have you told racist jokes? Have you used racial slurs? What's holding you back from doing it again? Do you seek out the friendship of others to learn from? Or do you have an adventuresome soul? Do you have the adventuresome soul that seeks to love others who you do not yet know. Do you only go out to teach, or do you go out to learn? Do you think you have all the answers? Or do you need to be taught? Have you asked somebody to teach you what it's like to be black in America? Do you want to know? Do you want to hear it firsthand? I know what it's like to be white in America. I don't need that instruction, and most of you don't either. It means to have privileges and power in racial terms. Even the poorest white man, so many think that they're better than their neighbors of color. I may be poor, but at least I'm not black. Well, I'm going to wind down. I speak with a small measure of hope, and I'm probably only speaking to the choir. Like I said, when I opened this video with the word racism, those who are offended by the word, who are offended by the mention of the word, that in itself is racist. If the word racism causes you to be offended, you're a racist. You're a racist. If the mere mention of the word. If you can't discuss it and talk about it in an open way, I feel sorry for you. And I feel your threat, because racists are mean people. They can be ever so nice and ever so lovely, but a racist is a backstabber. A racist is a hypocrite. They don't live for the approval of God, they live for the approval of others. And it's the others who are like them that they want that approval. Racism, it's a mean and wicked thing. And it's never meaner, never more wicked than when it's sweet and kind and nice. Okay. That's all I've got to say for now. Keep in touch.